The Italian Mafia of the United States is one of the most famous criminal organizations in the world. Dozens of films have been made and hundreds of books written about it. But there are only a handful of works that describe the early history of what would later become the Cosa Nostra. Mostly, the reason why the things were like this was the influence of the lack of sufficient and reliable information about that period. Because of this, the story of the appearance of the Mafia on the American continent, written during the information vacuum, and still being replicated by mass media as the only true one, in practice is more of a myth than the real picture of what happened. But fortunately for us, by now the researchers have received enough information about the circumstances to recreate a more accurate history of that period. So if you're interested in what Cosa Nostra was really like in its infancy in the United States, then give a reception. The Becoming of the New York Mafia on the Other Side of the Law. Before we begin, I would like to clarify what is the most common current approach of explaining the origins of Cosa Nostra, especially for those who are not aware of this topic, so they may understand what I reject by suggesting another version, in my opinion, more accurate and credible interpretation. In short, until recently it was believed that until 1931 the Mafia in the United States was a poorly organized group of gangs that continuously feuded with each other for the right to establish their representative as main boss of all Mafia. In addition, it was claimed that the old-school mafiosi who had come to America at a mature age, the so-called mustachioed Petes, were totally against working, not only with people of another nation, but even with Italians not from Sicily. However, the new school mafiosi did not agree with this approach. They had already been born or had come to America at an early age, grown up here. They did not want to limit their illegal business by working exclusively with their compatriots, seeing an inter-ethnic cooperation perspective for greater earnings. All this eventually led to a war between the new school and the old school, which ended with Charles Lucky Luciano took advantage of conspiracies between two bosses and eliminated all bosses in a short period of time, killing dozens of old-school mobsters across the country, and then convincing the rest to refuse the title of Supreme Boss and setting up a commission where the decision would be made by voting, thus begun the world-famous Cosa Nostra. You have to admit, it all sounds more like a movie script than a real story. It's all black and white. The bad, the old, and the bloodthirsty, because of their desire for power and its conformism, which was pulling the group back and preventing it from developing. But then something new appears, which has no need for power, but only wants the common good in the form of development and perspective. This new one wins, the group unites, and goes all together into a bright future to make money, solving all problems together. In reality, however, everything was not so simple and clear. As it turns out, the old and the new were not so different and quietly existed with each other before and after 1931. Without a doubt, the Mafia evolved and evolved over time, but it never had a reformist prophet who changed everything. There are more colors in the history of the Cosa Nostra than black and white, and the causes and degree of change are different from what most still claim. The first credible mention of the American Mafia dates back to the Matrang family from New Orleans and dates back to the 70s and 80s of the 19th century. The story is supposed to be about them today, but New Orleans has never been a place where events were central to the history of Cosa Nostra. Everything important during this period took place in New York City, where all the bosses of the bosses lived. Most widespread conflict, called the Castellammarese War, took place there, eventually affecting by different ways on all the other cities because the largest diaspora of Italians, including 5 mafia families, were located in this city. Everything that was going on in New York at the time influenced the Mafia all over the country, which is why our story today does not begin in New Orleans, but in the Big Apple. The history of the New York Mafia has its origins in the first known boss of all the Cosa Nostra bosses named Giuseppe Morello and his crime family. Although this figure is foundational to the story of the late 19th and early 20th century period, and his story will form the basis of the first part of our narrative. It is also worth mentioning earlier references of the Mafia presence in New York before that. In total, these examples are not 100% proof and should not be regarded as the truth in the last instance. But the fact that the evidence of the existence of the Mafia in the Big Apple is several decades earlier than generally accepted indicates that the history of this organization may have much deeper roots than we know today. The first mention of the American Mafia takes us as far back as the 1860s and associates with a man named Michael Chiamante. According to various reports, was connected with the Mafia in Sicily and then moved to America, where he engaged in counterfeiting. According to researchers, it was Chiamante who possibly was the first Mafia boss in New York. Then, 19 years later, the local press published a series of articles about the immigrant Rosario Mele and his 3 subordinates who were members of a secret organization called the Mafia. Reporters would call Mele the leader of the organization. 9 years later, in New York, a murdered man named Antonio Flacamillo turned out to be a police informant who managed to inform Detective Thomas Byrne about a secret criminal association of Italians, naming among its members himself, the brothers Carlo and Vincenzo Quattarero, and the brothers Carmelo and Raymond Faraci, who were connected with the previously mentioned Michael Chiamante. Also, the investigation of this case led law enforcement authorities to the idea that another potential founder of the New York Mafia could be the Sicilian bandit Giuseppe Esposito, who founded his family in 1878. The murder of Flacamillo, in their version, was revenge for his betrayal of Esposito. Finally, the same murder leads us to a man named Candelario Bettini, firstly the possible participant in the plot against Flacamillo, and secondly guilty in 1896 in charges of counterfeiting. An investigation revealed that according to one version, Bettini was the head of the local mafia, and according to another, he was the executor of a real boss named Nicola Taranto. As you can see from what was said earlier, references to the Mafia revealed in New York as early as the mid-19th century, and everyone who was known as a potential member of criminal organization was connected to others. Nevertheless, at this point we cannot accept these theories as true because the evidence base is too small, although I highly recommend keeping them in mind as an alternative course of events. We will take Giuseppe Morello as the confirmed founder of the New York Mafia in our story and about whom we will now speak. Morello's life and work is not just a story about the man. By and large, everything we know about the life and deeds of the Mafia of the period from 1890 to 1910 was in his life, and Giuseppe himself was a key figure in the formation of the New York Mafia of those years. Therefore, the following narrative is not a biography of an individual personality, but a description of the early history of Cosa Nostra and how the first American mafiosi lived and acted. He was born in Sicily in 1867 in a town called Corleone. His father, Colleggero, died when Giuseppe was not 10 years old, so his mother, Angela Piazza, had to find another husband to support her children, Bernardo Terranova. The stepfather was one of the first members of the Corleone Mafia organization called Fratuzzi, as well as Morello's uncle, Giuseppe Battaglia. So it is not a surprise that growing up, Giuseppe followed the same path. In Sicily, Morello had time to distinguish himself by the murder of a field guard chief, Giovanni Vella, for which he received no punishment, as well as managing a group of counterfeiters, for which he received a 6-year prison sentence. Giuseppe knew about the impending arrest in advance and left Sicily in 1893, settling in New York. Soon he would be joined by the rest of his closest relatives, with whom they would settle down in the fledgling Little Italy neighborhood. The forced move coincided with one of the worst crises in the American economy. Thousands of companies across the country were declaring bankruptcy, and unemployment in New York reached the 25% mark by the end of the year. The Morello Terranova family of 4 adults and 7 children lived very poorly. In the beginning, the men had few low-paying jobs, which coupled with the sale of some personal belongings had somehow made it possible to pay their rent and buy food. But by the end of the year, the situation in New York had become so dire that Giuseppe went to Louisiana, where he could find work on the farms. There he worked first as a fruit peddler and then found work in the cane fields, allowing the rest of his family to follow him and earn a living growing cane. You may ask why the Mafia couple, represented by Morello and his stepfather, did not return to their old occupation immediately upon their arrival, but went to work their backs off in regular jobs. There was one prosaic reason. Giuseppe had an outstanding conviction in Sicily, and for 3 years he was not allowed to draw the attention of American authorities, since, according to the laws of the time, immigrants who had lived in the States for more than 3 years were immune to deportation. That's why Morello had to keep his head down for 3 years, pretending to be a good citizen, so that he would not be deported to Italy, where he would immediately be locked up for 6 years. This is why he and his family toiled in the fields of Louisiana and then in the fields of Texas until the end of 1896. Giuseppe returned to New York in early 1897. By this time, the crisis had passed and the Italian community had more than tripled. Compared to 1893, the Little Italy area was booming, which offered an opportunity for people like Morello to engage in criminal activity. However, Giuseppe's first known businesses, which he opened after his return, were quite legal. With his stepfather, he took up plastering, and in his personal possession was a small coal warehouse, a bar, and a date factory. Where he got the money to open them, we can only guess. But he clearly had not been taught how to run a business, because all the startups, except the one with his stepfather, were unsuccessful. In 1898, Morello returned to the counterfeiting profession. It was also around the same time that he gained the title of boss of his own mafia family. It is worth noting the fact that families even at that time were not created simply because someone wanted to create one. Morello had to get permission to do this, but where he got it from, it is impossible to say for sure. It could have been New Orleans, where the mafia had its deepest roots. It could have been Sicily as the immediate home of the secret society. Finally, it could have been New York. You consider the assumptions about the birth of the mafia that we talked about earlier. Besides, there is a possibility that he might have led an already existing family. In any case, a year after his return to New York, Giuseppe became a mafia boss and returned to illegal activities. And it was no surprise that he chose counterfeiting. Firstly, he had already done this in Sicily, and secondly, there were many other Sicilians in New York who were doing the same thing here. There should have been no shortage of personnel. Morello formed a group of trusted Italians who were directly involved in the manufacture of forgeries. He hired some small Irish gangsters to distribute them through his man. Documentation was perfect. Only his own men knew about the place of production, and it was the Irishmen who really took the risk. Besides, Giuseppe never personally handed over the forgeries for distribution, trusting all these matters to his man named Collegieri Maggiore. Morello, like a true boss, sat on the sidelines and watched it all work, bringing him good dividends. His gang printed $5 bills and sold them to the Irish for $2 apiece. By the way, in those days a worker day salary was $2. Although Morello's production was not large, they printed about 200 bills a month, which brought in about $400, the equivalent of 10 months' wages of an ordinary worker. The company provided Morello faithfully for 2 years, and after was shut down by the Secret Service, engaged at the time directly to the fight against counterfeit. The authorities managed to put the Irish distributors and Maggiore, who provided them with counterfeits, in jail, but they could not prove Morello's involvement. However, this did not mean that Giuseppe immediately gave up this way of making money. To be on the safe side, he sent the printing press and blanks to Sicily, setting up production there. Counterfeits printed in Italy were then shipped to the States through the firm of another mafioso named Ignazio Lupo, who owned a wholesale grocery company. Money was hidden in jars of olive oil and on arrival was no longer distributed through the Irish, with the help of other Sicilians all over the country. By this time, Morello, as the new boss, had established connections with mafiosi in other American cities and was making full use of them for cooperation. Naturally, the young mafia's family's ways of earning money were not limited by making counterfeit bills. They were also engaged in protection racketeering, demanding money from their fellow businessmen for working without incident. If you take into account the widespread extortionist activity at the time, called the Black Hand, was not at all difficult and did not always even require the use of force, since unlike the Black Hand, the mafiosi took less payment, although on a permanent basis. The Black Hand, for those who do not know, was a common type of extortion among Italian immigrants at the time when the bandits sent their victim a letter with a black hand and demanded a sum of money. If it was not received, the victim could be killed. In the early stages of studying Italian criminal communities, the Black Hand was often confused with the Mafia, or even unify them, which is fundamentally wrong. Black Hand is the name of a type of extortion, not a criminal society. It wasn't just mafiosi who were involved in it. More accurately, in most cases, it was people with no connection to the mafia, since the Sicilian criminal organization was still too small, and the crimes of the so-called Black Hand were hundreds, if not thousands, per year. Nevertheless, the men of honor were happy to exploit the unwanted fame of the Black Hand extortionists. Moreover, they even perfected their approach. The mobsters could write a threatening letter and then offer to help resolve the matter themselves, making the victim indebted to the death. For example, Morello pulled one of these scams with a doctor named Salvatore Romano, who, after this gratuitous help, was forced to treat all of Morello's numerous relatives for free. Because of this, the doctor left New York in order not to be completely ruined. In addition to extortion and racketeering, the Morello family was also involved in gambling and the creation of several trusts controlling certain parts of the economic area. His half-brother, Vincenzo Terranova, was the head of the company which controlled the supply of ice, an important item in the absence of refrigerators, and another brother, Ciro Terranova, monopolized the entire market of artichokes, for which he earned the nickname Artichoke King. However, the Morello family, even with these achievements, was far from the power of future generations of mafiosi. All their activities were concentrated exclusively in the Italian neighborhoods of New York City. When I say that some of them controlled something, robbed someone, or took something away, I am referring only to the Italian neighborhoods. During the first decade of the 20th century, New York City was simply overflowing with various gangs with a membership of up to 1,000 people. Most of them, of course, did not have a strict structure and hierarchy, which caused almost all of them to disintegrate by the mid-1910s. At this point, they were a very serious force, which moreover was supported by the Tammany Hall political organization, so that the early mafiosi were only left to cower their compatriots in Little Italy. In addition, the composition of the families of the time were not more than 20 to 30 people, which was another reason not to stick out beyond the diaspora of compatriots. However, their small number was not only a weakness, but also a strength. The biggest part of the Morello family came from the Corleones, many of whom were also related to each other. So, they were people who could always rely on each other, which made it extremely difficult for the authorities to get them to testify. In addition, Morello, in order to further minimize this possibility, imposed the strictest discipline on his organization by punishing in the harshest possible way the slightest infraction that could potentially expose the group to the authorities. Some notable examples include the murder of Giuseppe Catania for telling a drunken acquaintance too much about Morello's counterfeit production, and the murder of Tommaso Pero, who removed a $1 watch from the murdered Benedetto Madonna, which almost cost Morello his freedom because it may have helped the police in their investigation. Basically, if the authorities at the time in 1903 proved Giuseppe's involvement in Madonna's death, it might have ended not even with a prison sentence, but with a death penalty, as the crime made a great resonance. The murdered man was found with his throat cut in a barrel in the middle of the street. Although New York City had seen all sorts of things in those days, it was too much even for this city. Morello wanted this execution to show what would happen to those mafiosi who dared to question his actions. Madonna wanted nothing more than to return the money that had been given to Morello to help his relative Giuseppe Di Primo, who was on trial. He thought that since Di Primo was in jail, Morello should give the money back. And when Giuseppe refused to do so, Benedetto threatened to go to the police, which immediately signed his own death warrant. Such measures on the part of Morello not only strengthened discipline within his gang, but also allowed him to rise to prominence in the entire American Mafia. Giuseppe was smart and ruthless, which gave him, between 1903 and 1910, the title Capo di Capi, which means boss of all bosses. This title is often attributed to the regalia of a certain mafia emperor who rules the other bosses as his vassals. However, this is not entirely true. The title Capo di Capi represented rather a judge who settled disputes between mafiosi. To make a very crude parallel, the boss of all bosses did the same thing as the commission would do after 1931, with one caveat. There were two other agencies above it, called the General Assembly and the Council. The General Assembly was analog to the later National Mafia Congresses. This agency passed death sentences of high-ranking mafiosi and elected a new boss of all bosses. The meeting of the council, on the other hand, did not imply the full composition of the General Assembly. The council has the power to settle less important disputes, while the boss of all bosses dealt with problems of a more mundane nature. That is, the mafia from its very appearance in America already had a democratic resolution of issues, and the commission that appeared after 1931 would not be something globally new, but only a slightly modified version of the old one. Although Morello was not in reality the all-powerful mafia overlord that he is sometimes portrayed as, he did hold a dominant position in New York City. His power in the local mafia was almost unconditional, which only allowed him to increase the money in his pocket each year. The chief of the Secret Service, William Flynn, estimated that between 1903 and 1907, Morello's gang earned about $200,000 from their businesses. That compares with $5.5 million in today's equivalent. A huge part of this money was brought to Giuseppe by an enterprise called the Ignazio Florio Cooperative. This firm was opened at the end of 1902 and was engaged in the construction of apartment buildings. Morello and his partners attracted hundreds of people as investors, ranging from ordinary Italians to wealthy Native Americans. Even high-ranking mafiosi from all over the country put their money into the venture. And at first, everything was going just fine. The houses were being built, the stock was going up, and the investors were happy. But then the crisis of 1907 happened, which was not smaller than the crisis of 1893. And Ignazio Florio's cooperative came to an end. Land and house prices fell, dragging the company's share price down with them. Investors, of course, demanded their investments back. Lawsuits from law-abiding citizens Morello was somehow able to ignore, but the demands of his colleagues, no. Despite his regalia as the boss of all bosses, he was in real danger of being sentenced to death. He had to get the money as soon as possible, and Giuseppe decided that the best way to find it was to print it himself. And since by this time the counterfeiting enterprise in Sicily was for some reason no longer available to him, so a new production had to be set up in the States. Pinned down, Morello was in an extreme hurry to open a production facility and made a fatal mistake that cost him his freedom. He hooked an outside man into the counterfeiting operation. The printer, Antonio Comito, was fraudulently involved in this enterprise, and when the work was completed in 1909, he was not eliminated as an undesirable witness. The Secret Service reached out to Morello in the fall of 1909, arresting Giuseppe and his potential accomplices. The state of affairs was such that, without a confession from anyone involved in the crime, Morello could again escape punishment. The arrest of Antonio Comito a few months later tipped the scales in the favor of the authorities. Comito's testimony, which he gave at his trial, convinced the jury to reach a verdict: guilty. Morello knew which sentences had been handed down for similar cases in the past and hoped to spend 3 to 5 years in prison. When the judge pronounced the sentence of 25 years, he fainted right in the dock. In addition to Giuseppe, 7 other people were convicted in this case. 6 of them received between 20 and 15 years, and Morello's closest associate, Ignazio Lupo, received the longest sentence of 30 years in prison. Such a long sentence for Giuseppe Morello meant only one thing: the most powerful mafia family had just been decapitated. But judging from the Russian fairy tale of the snake, Berinich, one head is cut off, 2 more appear at once. Same thing happened here. Those mafia families that had hitherto been in the shadows immediately began to come out into the light and began to fight mercilessly for their place in the sun. After Giuseppe Morello was put behind bars for a quarter of a century, the New York Mafia had its darkest, bloodiest times in its history. Endless wars of clans, and the bosses' heads flew off their shoulders faster than bowling balls. But before we plunge into events, I want to offer you, firstly, to get acquainted with the main characters of the narrative so that I do not have to explain every time who is who. Secondly, listen about formation of the first mafia families, which will be also important for understanding the future storytelling. The 5 New York families were created by groups of Italians from 3 regions of Sicily: they are Palermo, Corleone, and Castellammarese del Golfo. Later, I will refer to them as the Palamantani clan, the Corleonesi clan, and the Castellammarese clan. The first one was probably the largest group in New York City. This was due to the fact that Palermo and its surrounding cities were banally larger than other regions. Therefore, there were many more mafiosi arriving on the shores of the New York world. The first mention of the Palermitani criminal clan dates back to 1896 to the previously mentioned personalities Candelario Bettini and Nicola Taranto. Apparently, one of them was one of the first bosses of this mafia family. As you remember, these bandits were put in jail in 1896 for counterfeiting, after which the path of the clan administration interrupted for several years, surfacing only in 1902, associate us with the name of Ignazio Lupo. In general, for a long time, Lupo was considered only a deputy of Giuseppe Morello, but as recently been known, it is more likely that by 1902 he was at the head of the Palermitani. This is evidenced by several facts at once. First, a letter from a New Orleans mobster, Francesco Mortisi, which he wrote to Morello. In it, Mortisi vouched for another mafioso who was, as he wrote, in the house of Lupo, except that in the house did not mean living in the building, but belonging to the criminal clan. This is confirmed by the biography of Joseph Bonanno, in which he expressed himself in the same way when he described the meeting between Maranzano and Masseria, when Maranzano described himself as belonging to the house of Shiro, the clan of another boss of those years. Secondly, several police informants claimed that Lupo spoke to Morello as an equal at meetings, and sometimes he could even interrupt him. That indicates their equal status. Thus, it turns out that from 1902 to 1910, Ignazio Lupo ruled the Palermitani clan. When he was imprisoned, however, power temporarily passed to his brother John Lupo, who ruled the family until it was clear that Ignazio would not be able to leave his confinement anytime soon. Salvatore Toto D'Aquila was then elected as the new boss and almost immediately received the title of Capo di Capi, and replaced a temporary performer, Sebastiano de Gaetano. However, D'Aquila was no longer the only boss of the Palermitani. At the same time, another family was founded with natives of the region headed by Manfredi Menio. Whether this was a new family, or as the Bagata say, was just established, or a group that broke away from D'Aquila, unfortunately, it cannot be ascertained nowadays. However, it is possible to say that in the future these two families would evolve into the currently known Gambinos and Colombo. The second clan was the Corleonesi, about whom we talked a lot in the first part of the video. The first known boss of this family was Giuseppe Morello. 1910 to 1912, while Morello tried to appeal his sentence, the real power was temporarily in the hands of Giovanni Pecoraro, and then officially passed to Fortunato Lomante. The Corleonesi acted as a whole until 1920. After, they split into two factions, led by Joseph Masserio and Gaetano Reina. In the future, these would be the Genovese and Lucchesi family. The third clan, which would later grow into the Bonanno family, was composed mainly of natives of the Castellammarese del Golfo region. The first known boss of the Castellammarese was Paolo Orlando. Firstly, came to America in 1900. Orlando remained in that position until about 1910, after which he voluntarily resigned. He was replaced by Sebastiano de Gaetano, who was also a boss of all bosses during this period. Gaetano left both positions in 1912, and the Borgata of Castellammarese was headed by Nicola Shiro, who retired in favor of Salvatore Maranzano only in 1930. You have probably already realized the future five families were formed on the basis of kinship or fraternity. There is nothing strange about this, considering that the Mafia is first of all a secret and then a criminal community. Leaders of the young American Borgats gathered around them those whom they knew personally or those for whom they could be vouched for by the mafiosi they knew. And if you remember that the bosses of that period were all first-generation immigrants on whose recommendations they could rely apart from the words of the comrades they had known since Sicily. So it turned out that a conditional Corleonan coming to the United States was drawn to Corleonans like himself. So for these new Corleonans who moved to Little Italy, to prevent shouting around, "I want to join the Mafia," the leader of the Borgata in Sicily gave him something like a letter of recommendation and sent a message to the American boss about the arrival. The boss in New York, for example, would decide for himself whether to take him in or not. Same way, Mafiosi were transferred between cities in the States. In addition, besides exchanging of personnel between America and Sicily, there were also well-established business contacts, but they were purely on a personal level. No common organization ever existed. Mafia in America was one society, the Mafia in Sicily another. The Italians may have applied to their homeland for permission to organize the very first Borgat. By the period we are talking about now, the United States already had its own autonomous community. All the ideas of unity stems from the fact that the first generation of American mobsters still had very strong personal contacts with Sicilians and often cooperated with local men of honor. At this point, I think that's enough talking about theory. I hope you have an understanding of what the New York Mafia was like in those years, because we're moving right into the point of things and starting the story of Cosa Nostra's most difficult time. The first Mafia war, which took place among the Tequila gang on one side and the Mineo, Shiro, and Morello gangs on the other, did not really have many victims and was not really a full-scale Mafia war, but a conflict to redistribute power and the imprisonment of leading Cosa Nostra bosses Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. Tequila, who afterwards gained possession of New York's largest borgata as well as the title of boss of all bosses, found himself in the strongest position compared to the other families. The Mineos had just been founded, the Shiros had little influence before, and the Morellos were weakened by the imprisonment of their boss and internal strife, which we will discuss later. This situation was an ideal setup for the authoritarian Tequila to spread his interests even more widely, which naturally displeased the three remaining families who opposed him with a united front. Apparently, the first Tequila opponent was Manfredi Mineo, and the war began as a confrontation between the two Palermitani clans, and soon other factions siding with Mineo joined. The chronology of this conflict is as follows. In 1913, Tequila went for Sicily, and the gangs of Mineo and Morello made use of it. They eliminated two of his men during the absence of the boss of all bosses. On the 4th of November, Giuseppe Fontana was killed, and then Giuseppe Fanera on the 25th of November. There may have been more victims, but because there were enough murders in the Italian neighborhoods at the time without mafia squabbles, it is not possible to establish this. After that, there was a short pause in the conflict caused by an unconfirmed truce between the parties. The next event that put the mafiosi back on the warpath was in 1914, when the leader of Morello, Fortunato Lamonte, was murdered in May. According to one version, Tequila took part in his death, which presented cold revenge. According to another, Lamonte fell victim to a feud within the Morello clan itself. Within the Corleonesi, almost from the first days of Giuseppe's imprisonment, tensions grew between the Lamonte brothers and the Terranova brothers. The first ones, in the early days of their rule, refused to avenge the death of Giuseppe's son, Morello and Collegieri Morello, nephew of the Terranova brothers. The Terranovas did so without their permission, so split the faction into two camps. In such a situation, Lamonte had to show the utmost diplomacy to bring the family back together, but they failed to do this. The next stumbling block was the issue of the territories of gangster and politician Jose Gallucci. The Terranovas wanted to kill Gallucci and take control of his possessions, while Lamonte was on close terms with Gallucci and even moonlighted as his security guard. It is probable that Fortunato was not murdered by Tequila, but by Terranova brothers, who then happily took over Gallucci's territory. Then happened the murders of the two members of the Morello family. On the 7th of October in 1915, Ippolito Greco was eliminated after Fortunato Lamonte as boss. On the 13th of October, Thomas Lamonte, Fortunato's own brother, was murdered. On the one hand, it could have been done by Tequila, who after these deaths finally established his dominance in New York. On the other hand, it also benefited the Terranova brothers because they took charge of the Morello Borgata after the elimination of Greco and Lamonte. In any case, the first Mafia war was won entirely by Tequila, and the strongest Borgata, Morello, lost much in its positions, and due to this, a new predator appeared on its horizon with a desire of taking over its territories. The Terranova brothers were at the head of the family, facing a new war against another secret Italian society called the Camorra. The Camorra is another criminal association originating from Italy. It predated the Mafia in the 1920s in Naples and was an organization for the mutual assistance of prisoners in prisons, then transferring its activities beyond the prison walls. The Camorra, like the Mafia, had its own hierarchy and initiation rituals. Their ways of making money were similar to Sicilian counterparts. In the States, the Camorra appeared at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries and was involved in racketeering, gambling, extortion, and the cocaine trade. In New York, the Camorraciti were weaker than Mafia, both in numbers and in the amount of money they made while keeping pace with only one component: brutality. Structurally, the New York Camorra, or it is also called the Brooklyn Camorra, was a group of several unrelated gangs. The borders of one of them passed near the borders of the Morello family. For a long time, the two organizations coexisted quite peacefully and even occasionally presented a united front. For example, the murder of the aforementioned Jose Gallucci was a collaborative operation, as well as the elimination of Joseph DeMarco, whose gambling business was then divided between the two organizations. However, the Neapolitan neighbors always looked at Morello with envy, as the Sicilians earned many times more on their rackets. So when the Terranova brothers suffered significant losses in the war against Tequila, the Camorra gangs decided to unite with them and fight together in order to take all the profitable businesses. The leaders of the Neapolitan gangs did not declare war outright, but instead came up with an almost perfect plan in which they wanted to lure the entire top of Morello with a friendly smile on their face to a peaceful meeting under the pretext of discussing business together. All the key members of the Mafia family, represented by the brothers Niccolo, Vincenzo, and Ciro Terranova, Stefano LaSalle, Eugene Ubriaco, and Giuseppe Verranzo were invited to the meeting. For various reasons, however, only Niccolo Terranova and Eugene Ubriaco came, which meant that the potential seizure of power could turn into a long and bloody confrontation, which eventually happened. The Neapolitans killed Terranova and Ubriaco in September 1916, thus starting a war with the Morello family. Active hostilities started when the Mafia Borgata, led by the Terranova brothers, was clearly defeated. The Camorra managed to kill Giuseppe Verranzano and take over all the gambling outlets, as well took from Ciro and Vincenzo power number of territories and seized most of the racketeers. It seemed that the once strong Mafia family might finally break down. However, the help came from where it was not expected. A former member of the Brooklyn Camorra, Ralph Daniello, who was hiding from the authorities outside New York because of a previous murder, upset that his bosses did not financially support him, went to the police and handed over the entire Neapolitan organization of the Big Apple. He talked about all the murders, all the illegal businesses, and gave the names of everyone he knew. Daniello's testimony was so valuable that the entire top power and many of the rank-and-file members of the Camorra were sent to prison for a long time before they could enjoy the conquered territories that were already in their hands. The Terranova brothers, on the other hand, had brought back most of the racketeers and were finally able to breathe. They did not yet know that just a couple of years later, the long-awaited exit of their half-brother Giuseppe Morello would not turn into a new round, but into another bloody conflict. In the last chapter, I mentioned that the Morello family was led by the Terranova brothers, but I left out one small detail. I did not mention the name Salvatore Loacano with his confusing story. Loacano appears to have been a marionette of Tequila, and headed for him after Fortunato Lamante's death, a group that separated from the Terranova gang. Loacano probably could also have taken part in Lamante's murder, after which the family split into Terranov supporters and Loacano supporters. Naturally, when Giuseppe Morello, released in the spring of 1920, was not at all happy about the state of affairs. While the Terranovas were ready to swear allegiance to him, Loacano had no intention of doing so. So in December of that year he was eliminated, and most of his men went back to Morello. However, the former boss of all bosses clearly overestimated his power and influence by committing the unauthorized murder of the head of the family. Firstly, several of Loacano's men publicly vowed to avenge the death of their boss. Secondly, Behind the murdered man was the current capo di capi, Toto Tequila, who was not eager to allow Morello to gain power again. All this naturally inflamed the situation and immediately led to a conflict known today as the Second War of the New York Mafia. For a little less than 6 months after Loiacano's death, Tequila watched the war between the murdered man's supporters and Morello from the sidelines. But by the spring of 1921, when it became clear that the Morello had eliminated almost all of the Loiacano, he decided to intervene. Tequila, between April and May of that year, convened a General Assembly in which he demanded the death penalty for Giuseppe Morello under the pretext of the unauthorized murder of Loiacano. In a heated debate and discussion, his demand was granted. The death list also included Ignazio Lupo and mafioso Umberto Valente, most likely because of their close contact with the condemned man. Giuseppe learned of his sentence almost as soon as it was handed down. From May to September, he managed to hide in New York, and in October, when the situation became particularly dangerous, he went to Sicily with Lupo and Valente. Apparently, his situation was truly disastrous if he risked going home with an outstanding 6-year prison sentence. The only chance of Morello had of returning to New York without fearing for his life was a friend of Umberto Valente's, Niccolo Gentile. Gentile was a highly respected mobster at the time, with connections throughout the United States. Morello and Valente asked him to convince bosses all over the country to reconvene a General Assembly and reconsider their death sentence. Gentile agreed to help, and for years he traveled around America making arrangements with local Borgat leaders. To give you an idea of how thoroughly he approached the case, we need to say that his journey can be conventionally compared to a computer game such as The Witcher 3, where, to complete the mission, the main character needs to pass a dozen bosses one by one, send him to other people, and for all of them he had to perform some quest. Gentile did something similar. He dealt and helped bosses all over the country and eventually successfully completed his mission, freeing Morello from the sword of Damocles hanging over him. The only condition for the removal of the sentence was that Giuseppe was no longer eligible to hold the position of family boss. All the time, Gentile was removing Morello's death sentence, and Giuseppe himself was trying to avoid getting shot. New York City was not quiet, even though there were no convicts. At least 6 people died that year because of the confrontation between Morello and Tequila. The removal of the sentence did not change the situation. Giuseppe had not even returned when his half-brother and part-time new family boss, Vincenzo Terranova, was murdered. In addition, shortly after Morello was outlawed, a faction led by Gaetano Reina split from the family and was now out of his jurisdiction. In this situation, Giuseppe, who himself had no right to head the Borgata, could only confront Tequila by supporting the nomination as family boss of Joe Masseria, who had skillfully used the opportunities provided by the dry law literally within a couple of years, had become a major force in the New York Mafia. Tequila saw that his opponents had a new general, lured Umberto Valente to his side, and aimed all his guns at Masseria. Throughout the summer of 1922, the opponents tried to get at each other. Masseria escaped certain death twice during this period. The assassins fired practically at point-blank range, but Joe the Boss survived each time. That cannot be said of Tequila's main gunman, Valente, who was killed on the 11th of August in 1922. After the opponents shot at each other for about another year, but no one ever gained a clear advantage. So on the 26th of August in 1923, a large Mafia peace conference was convened, at which it was decided to end the conflict and lay down their arms, which in fact meant only a transition to a state of Cold War. Masseria and Morello began to prepare for the potential resumption of the confrontation by adding new members to their families. It was the moment when Joe the Boss would be the first to begin accepting mainland Italians into the organization. Frankie Yale and Frank Costello, the Calabrians, and Vito Genovese and Willie Moretti, the Neapolitans, found themselves in the Mafia precisely because of Masseria. In fact, the renewal of the conflict in 1928 was in part due to this innovation of Masseria. He had that year welcomed Al Capone, a Neapolitan from Chicago, into the family, supported him against other local mafiosi. By this, he did not please Tequila. This time another Parlamentani family led by Manfredi Mineo, after the murder of D'Aquila in September 1928, took his borgata under his control, also sided with Morello, and Joe Masseria, supported by Giuseppe Morello, was elected the new boss of all bosses. But as history has shown, this established order was given even less time than the previous ones. The final test of the early New York Mafia was just around the corner. Before discussing the Castellammarese War and its causes, its course, and its influence on the Mafia in general, I want to offer you a little talk about how Prohibition affected Cosa Nostra, because during the Second Mafia War this context could be omitted. But by the time of the Castellammarese conflict, bootlegging was the main livelihood of the five families, and this business is a good example of how the Mafia has changed in its almost 30 years of presence in the United States, if it has changed at all. The Volstead Act is generally considered the main frontier for the Cosa Nostra, after the passage of which the Mafia was forced to lift its iron curtain and begin to cooperate with the gangsters of other nations. However, this is not entirely true. First of all, even before Prohibition, the mafiosi had already cooperated with gangsters of non-Sicilian origin. For example, the same Giuseppe Morello in the early days of his career involved Irishmen in the distribution of counterfeit banknotes, and Joe Masseria collaborated with Jewish gangsters, as was confirmed by an informant, Salvatore Clemente. Do not forget that it was Masseria who introduced the practice of admitting mainland Italians into the Mafia. Secondly, some bosses, even during Prohibition, acted exclusively in partnership with their compatriots and retained this preference even after the abolition of the law. This was due to the fact that the Mafia in America has never been a monolithic structure. For example, in New York there were 5 families, and each was a separate organization with its own administration and all the general bodies that stood above them. If we draw an analogy within a legitimate institution of government, they were not executive, but a mixture of judicial and legislative. So the General Assembly and later the Commission had the power of settling disputes, not to give orders. So when we say that the Mafia during Prohibition or whenever underwent any meaningful change in its structure, we must first see if all families were affected and only then draw conclusions about the general trend. And in the question of cooperation with other nations, we cannot say that the alcohol prohibition forced all mafiosi to work with non-Italians. Much of this decision depended on the boss of each individual borgata. This is why, for example, Masseria, who after 1923 took in more than a few members with his team, gave his men relative freedom in the choice of partners as long as they constantly sent a share. On the contrary, Maranzano did his business mostly with Sicilians and wanted his men to follow the same example. On this basis, it cannot be said that Prohibition was the period when there was a definitive change in this matter. We can only say that it laid the seed of an idea that in the future would grow into what we now know as the Mafia partner, and that in a few decades, in one way or another, the bosses of all the families would adopt. The second important question to be discussed is how strong the bootlegger conglomeration was, and if it is true that there was a common arrangement among the major gangsters throughout the country. The main argument that there was a unified organization of America's key bootleggers is a reference to a nationwide meeting of gangsters in 1929 in Atlantic City. However, modern researchers had looked through the press and archives of those days and refuted this statement and found that the real reason for the meeting, in fact, the convention was convened only to settle disagreements among the leaders of the Chicago gangs, and it is connected with other cities. More to say, there had not even been a nationwide conglomerate of bootleggers. Gangsters had formed alliances to expand their interests, but they did not expand to include all the United States. In addition, it must be understood that there were 2 main activities in the illegal liquor business. These are production within the states and the smuggling of goods from abroad. In each of them, there were their own alliances and agreements, often not overlapping in any way. As can be seen from the information above, the Mafia had not undergone any structural changes during the first 30 years of its existence in the States. The hierarchy and the system of dispute resolution which appeared at the very beginning of its emergence worked by the time of the Castellammarese War. Each family was an independent unit which led individual borgata to its own separate way of development. The future creation of the commission was implemented precisely to ensure that every view of overall development was heard and the process of individual evolution of each individual family proceeded without interference from outside members of the mafia. The commission was necessary because the independent structures called families that make up the mafia since the days of Tequila were beginning to be subjected by each new boss of all bosses to pressure and attempts to gradually reduce their independence. This was not even because the position gave unlimited power. As I said, the capo di capi played a kind of role of judge rather than leader-manager. And with the fact that the people occupying this position were also the bosses of the strongest borgatas of the country, and were authoritarian and overbearing by nature. Because of this, their actions began to pervert the original role of the boss of all bosses, which led to the War of the Castellammarese and the replacement of this title by a collegial body represented by a commission. Before discussing the war directly, let me repeat once again that the attempts to consolidate power in one hand were not about the position of the boss of all bosses and this role, but about the fact that the leaders of the country's strongest families at various times tried to maximize their influence. Masseria, for example, started doing this long before he got his title and naturally didn't stop afterwards. Joe the Boss led the strongest borgata of New York after the assassination of Tequila, which allowed him to dictate his rules of the game, and he tried to extend to other cities by supporting allied factions in them. Naturally, this situation could not suit everyone, and eventually a group of mafiosi led by Salvatore Maranzano rebelled against Masseria. This confrontation was called the Castellammarese War. The beginnings of this conflict go back to when Masseria supported Al Capone against Joe Aiello in Chicago. Many people did not like the fact that Joe the Boss sided with the Neapolitan, but the open confrontation did not begin. Then, in New York in February of 1930, mob boss Gaetano Reina, who ran the major share of the lucrative racket in the ice trade, was murdered. Although this death may have been related to competition in Reina's sphere, the mafia community saw it as a move by Masseria to get his possession on Reina's enterprise, since his replacement, Joseph Pinzolo, was more cooperative. With this move, Joe the Boss made his first enemy in Tommaso Galliano, who would later oust Joe Pinzola as boss. After this, Masseria saw no immediate opposition and considered the elimination of Reina a successful move. Tried to gain influence in Detroit, where he would support Chester Lemaire, who in May 1930 would kill Gaspar Milazzo, whose death would be the trigger for another faction to turn against Masseria. Milazzo, before leaving for Detroit, had lived in New York and had been part of a local family formed by his countrymen from Castellammarese del Golfo, who became the second enemy of Joe the Boss in this war. Milazzo's death caused outrage among the Castellammarese New Yorkers and the family boss Niccolo Schiro, who did not want to fight the Masseria. To resign voluntarily made a way for Salvatore Maranzano as head. Maranzano was a high-ranking mafioso in Sicily, and after moving to the United States in the mid-1920s was forced to start his career from the bottom. It is likely that here he also wanted to reach significant heights. Therefore, for him the war with Masseria was not just a way to avenge his countrymen, but also a chance to climb to the top of the American Mafia if he won. Maranzano had been preparing his first strike for about a month after winning the title of boss. During that time, he had time to buy weapons and welcome new members into the family. The first target was Giuseppe Morello, who was the brain and strategist of the Masseria. Maranzano believed that Joe the Boss's actions were directed by a gray cardinal in the person of Morello, and by killing him, victory would only be a matter of time. As it would later turn out, he was partly right. In August 1930, Morello would be murdered in his office by a gunman, Sebastiano Domingo. A month later, Tommaso Galliano killed Masseria's marionette Joe Pinzolo and took the Reina family, then sided with Maranzano. Masseria responded in October by killing Joe Aiello in Chicago through Al Capone, which by and large was a dead giveaway, for in just a month he would lose his strongest ally in New York. In November, Manfredi Mineo and Stefano Ferrigno would be killed, and the new leaders of the family would defect to Maranzano. This meant that 3 of the 4 New York families were against Joe Boss. Another, led by Profaci, remained neutral, and he himself lost a key man in the person of Morello. A clear feeling was beginning to emerge among the American Mafia that he was no longer a winner. Therefore, in late 1930 and early 1931, a meeting was convened in Boston where the title of boss of all bosses was removed from Masseria, making a local leader, Gaspar Messina, its temporary bearer. Also at this time, a commission was convened for the first time composed of Gaspar Messina, Niccolo Gentile, Vincent Troy, Joseph Saragusa, and Salvatore Laverdi. They were charged with the mission of resolving the conflict and ending the war. Masseria already anticipated his defeat and was only too happy to lay down his arms. He also offered the commission his demotion to a soldier if that would help settle the Maranzano issue. Moreover, under the pretext of fearing arrests, he forced his men to disarm, which caused a storm of indignation among them. Plus, Masseria withdrew significantly from his men, spending most of his time with the guards in his house. Basically, by these actions he simply left his subordinates no choice. None of them wanted to be shot just because their boss had ordered them not to defend themselves. Besides, at the same time, Maranzano declared that he wanted Joe the boss's head, and after that he wasn't going to touch the others. It is not surprising that in this situation, Masseria's men, led by Charles Luciano, made an alliance with Maranzano behind his back and killed Joe the boss on the 15th of April in exchange for an end to the war. Until not long ago, it was believed that after the fall of the Masseria, Maranzano established the 5 families of New York and took the first step in creating the modern Cosa Nostra. But at this point, researchers have proven that the family structure existed long before that, as we have actually talked to you about before. The claim itself was born from the words of Valachi, who described a meeting in the Bronx after the war where the bosses of the 5 families were represented. In fact, this procedure was not a point of reference, but merely a way of introducing the new members, such as Valachi, to the already established system. The only changes introduced after the war were the prohibition of one man's membership in America and in Sicily at the same time, which was common in the past, and stop of recruitment of new members. Families could now only accept people to replace those who had retired to avoid a future situation in which the Borgata boss decided to increase his influence at the expense of new members. Other than that, everything remained as it was. Just now, Luciano was in charge of the family instead of Masseria, Frank Scalisi replaced by Vincent Mangiano, after the murder of Maranzano, and Maranzano himself was then replaced by Joe Bonanno. Until his death, which has several reasons, Maranzano will occupy the position of boss of all bosses. The first reason for eliminating Maranzano was that after his victory he was still living for war. The last boss of all bosses did not trust his former adversaries, and despite his promise to bury the hatchet in return for Masseria's death, he planned to eliminate. His firing list included such names as Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, Dutch Schultz, and Vito Genovese, among others. The second reason was that Maranzano got into the clothing industry racket where Luciano was already working with Louis Lepke, the accountant. Luciano and Lepke supported one union leader, and Maranzano supported another, which caused a conflict of interest and could have cost Luciano the lucrative racket. In the end, these two causes, which occurred around the same time, overlapped and forced Luciano into a new conspiracy. And in September of 1931, the last boss of all bosses, Salvatore Maranzano, was murdered in his own office. Luciano then proved to the rest of the mafiosi the existence of a firing list, and on this basis his act was approved. The abolition of the title of boss of all bosses and the subsequent commission that was created after the removal of Maranzano, as you have probably already understood, was not Luciano's. Firstly, there were earlier forms of collegial decision-making under the names Council and General Assembly that we spoke of earlier. Secondly, something similar was already implemented during the Castellammarese War, as I also mentioned earlier. That is to say, the commission is not a revolutionary innovation that Luciano descended from heaven, but merely a reform of an already existing system that has been brought up to speed. The General Assembly was not easy to convene. The council had limited powers, and the boss of all bosses was, as history has shown, highly subjective. That's why there was a commission made up of the bosses of the strongest families in the country, which was easy to convene. They could decide any issue and consisted of several people, which reduced the subjectivity of decisions. The commission, of course, was not a governing body. It was a body to decide general issues, and the individual affairs of the families were kept behind closed doors. The first commission consisted of the heads of the 5 families of New York, as well as Al Capone of Chicago and Stefano Magaddino of Buffalo. Another issue that just needs to be discussed is the positioning of the Castellammarese War and the Masseria and Maranzano murders as a battle of new and old school. Americanized mobsters against traditionalists. Firstly, one of the arguments in this favor is the creation of the commission as a revolutionary innovation of the new school, which we have just refuted. Secondly, none of the participants in the events who have since described it in their biographies have positioned the conflict in this way. Thirdly, it is not quite clear who is to be considered a traditionalist and who is to be considered an Americanized one. If we take Luciano as an example of an Americanized gangster, how do we calculate a traditionalist? By age? Well, Luciano was just over 30 when the war started, but Joe Bonanno, who was considered a traditionalist, was not even 30. Or could they be defined by their progressive views? Then it turns out that Masseria, who was the first to accept non-Sicilians into the organization, is no longer the traditionalist who was removed by the Americanized Luciano. So it turns out that these concepts are too vague and more suitable for the headlines than for real life. In every member of the Mafia, there was both the traditional adherence to the rules of the organization, which originated many decades ago, and the American, the desire to conduct illegal activities along the lines of business and making money. And this whole division is nothing more than an attempt to frame it for a prettier story. The story of the early Mafia is not about one man changing everything, and it's not about a struggle between the old and the new. It's about gradual evolution and finding the optimal regulation of deals through mistakes and dozens of liters of spilled blood.